Hi, everyone. My name's Helen, and I'm 63 years old. I wasn't sure I'd ever share this story, but the other night, as I sat by the fireplace flipping through an old photo album, I realized it was time. Maybe someone out there needs to hear this, because sometimes life's most shocking truths come when you least expect them. It all started 3 years ago, right after my husband, Joe, passed away. We were high school sweethearts, married for 41 years. Joe was my rock. He'd built our little home in Oregon with his own 2 hands, and there wasn't a single soul in town who didn't love him. When he passed, I felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. Suddenly, I was alone in a way I hadn't been since I was 17. To cope, I buried myself in cleaning the house. You know, sorting through closets, boxing up old sweaters. It gave me something to do when the silence became too loud. One evening, as I cleared out a stack of dusty boxes in the attic, I stumbled across a small, locked chest I didn't recognize. It was covered in cobwebs, and the metal latch was rusted, but the moment I saw it, I froze. Something about it felt heavy, like it carried more than just trinkets inside. I spent the next hour trying to pry it open with everything from a butter knife to a pair of pliers. When I finally got the lock to snap, my hands were shaking. Inside, there were a few yellowed papers, a couple of black and white photographs, and a folded letter with my name written on the front. The handwriting was my mother's. Now, to give you a little backstory, my mom, Dolores, passed away 20 years ago. She was a no-nonsense kind of woman, a nurse who worked double shifts and somehow still managed to bake the best peach cobbler in 3 counties. But she never talked much about my father. He died in a car accident when I was 2, or at least, that's what she always told me. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. My dearest Helen. The letter began in that elegant, looping script I hadn't seen in decades. If you're reading this, it means you've found the chest. I've kept it hidden because I wasn't sure you'd ever need to know the truth. But if life has brought you to this point, then perhaps it's time. I sat down on the attic floor, my breath catching in my throat. The letter went on to say that my father hadn't died in a car crash. In fact, he hadn't died at all. Dolores had met my father, William, in the summer of 1958. He was charming, quick-witted, and full of big dreams, an aspiring writer who swept her off her feet with poems scribbled on napkins. But there was a side of him she didn't see at first. He had a darkness, a restlessness that led him to gamble away their savings and disappear for weeks at a time. When I was born, my mother thought it might change him. It didn't. One night, when I was just 2 years old, he packed a suitcase and left. My mother begged him to stay, but he walked out the door without a second glance. She told everyone he died in a car crash because the truth was too painful. As I sat there, staring at her words, a mix of anger and sadness boiled inside me. How could she lie to me for all these years? How could she let me grow up believing a man who was very much alive was dead? The next day, I took the photographs from the chest and started searching online. One of the pictures showed him standing in front of a neon sign that read Lucky's Bar, Reno. It wasn't much to go on, but I called every bar in Reno with the name Lucky's. After a dozen dead ends, I finally hit gold. A bartender who'd worked there for 30 years told me William had been a regular back in the day. He didn't know where he was now, but he remembered him leaving town abruptly sometime in the late 80s. I didn't give up. Over the next 6 months, I pieced together fragments of his life from old phone books, public records, and sheer determination. Eventually, I found him living in a tiny town in Arizona, about 5 hours outside of Phoenix. Now, here's where things get really strange. When I finally worked up the courage to call, an elderly woman answered the phone. Her name was Barbara, and she was my father's second wife. When I explained who I was, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Oh, honey, I was wondering if you'd ever find us." Turns out, Barbara knew about me. William had told her he had a daughter from his first marriage, but he claimed my mother wanted nothing to do with him. That was his version of the story, of course. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Arizona. When I saw him for the first time, sitting on a porch swing with a cane leaning against his knee, my heart almost stopped. He was frail, with a shock of white hair and watery blue eyes. But when he looked up at me, there was no mistaking it. We shared the same stubborn chin, the same narrow nose. I won't lie, our first conversation was awkward. He apologized, said he was young and foolish back then, that he didn't know how to be a father. I wanted to scream at him, but instead, I just listened. For the next 2 days, we talked about everything, his life, my life, the decades we'd missed. It didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me something I didn't realize I needed, closure. When I flew back home, I brought the chest with me. It sits in my living room now, a reminder of a truth I never expected to find. Life has a funny way of hiding secrets in plain sight, doesn't it? So, if you've got questions about your past, or people you've given up on, maybe it's time to go digging. You never know what you might find. I thought that was the end of the story. I met my father, got the answers I never thought I'd have, and I could finally close that chapter of my life. But life, as it turns out, wasn't quite done with its surprises. A month after I returned home, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written on the envelope in a neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only 3 words written on it. Look beneath Lucky's. My hands shook as I read it. Was this a joke? A prank? I hadn't told anyone about the bar in Reno or my search for my father. The only people who knew were him, Barbara, and me. I decided to let it go, but the words gnawed at me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 words. So, a week later, I booked a flight to Reno. When I arrived at Lucky's bar, it was nothing like the photo from the chest. The neon sign was gone, replaced with a dull, hand-painted board. Inside, the place was a shadow of its former self, dingy booths, sticky floors, and a bartender who looked like he hadn't smiled in decades. I ordered a drink and made small talk, pretending I was just another out-of-towner. Eventually, I mentioned I'd heard the bar had a lot of history and asked if there were any secrets about the place. The bartender gave me a suspicious look but eventually sighed and said, "Yeah, the old owner, Lucky, used to stash money under the floorboards back in the day." "That what you're asking about?" My heart skipped a beat. He pointed to the far corner of the bar, where an ancient jukebox stood. "If there's anything under there, that's where it'd be. But good luck moving it, thing weighs a ton." I waited until the bar closed, bribing the bartender with a 20 to let me stay late. With his help, we shoved the jukebox aside, revealing a loose wooden plank underneath. My pulse raced as I pried it open with a crowbar he lent me. Inside was an old leather bag, dusty and brittle with age. When I opened it, I almost fell over. It was stuffed with cash. Not just a few bills, hundreds of them, tied in neat bundles. It had to be at least $20,000, maybe more. "What the hell?" the bartender muttered, staring at the money. But that wasn't all. Beneath the bag was a small metal box. Inside it were photographs of my father. In one of them, he was sitting at a table with a man I didn't recognize, except for one detail. He wore the same ring that Lucky, the bartender from the 50s, was known to wear. Back at my hotel, I stared at the photographs for hours. Something didn't add up. Why would Lucky have photos of my father? And why had someone told me to look beneath the bar? The next day, I went to the local library and dug through their archives. After hours of searching, I found an old newspaper article from 1960. Local bar owner, Lucky Fitzgerald, found dead in mysterious circumstances. The article went on to describe how Lucky had been found behind the bar, shot twice in the chest. The case had never been solved. Witnesses claimed he'd gotten into a heated argument with a man earlier that evening, but no one had identified the suspect. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Could my father have been involved? When I got home, I called Barbara. I didn't want to accuse anyone of anything, but I needed answers. Her voice softened when I mentioned Lucky. "Oh, Helen," she said, sighing. "William always said he regretted that night." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated before continuing. "Lucky owed your father money. A lot of money. Your dad went to confront him about it, but things got heated. He swore he didn't pull the trigger, but he was there when it happened. That's why he left Reno. That's why he ran from you and your mother. He thought if anyone ever connected him to Lucky's death, you'd pay the price." I sat there in stunned silence. My father, the man I'd spent months searching for, wasn't just a gambler or a drifter. He'd been a fugitive, carrying the weight of a man's death on his conscience for decades. I didn't know what to do with this information. On one hand, it didn't change the fact that he'd abandoned us. But on the other, it explained so much about his restless, haunted nature. I decided to confront him. I drove back to Arizona, unannounced. When I arrived, he was sitting in his usual spot on the porch, staring out at the desert. "Why didn't you tell me?" I blurted out, holding up the photograph of him and Lucky. He looked at me with tired eyes. "Because I didn't want you to know that side of me." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I didn't come looking for a perfect man. I came looking for my father." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I thought running would protect you. But it only hurt you. I'm sorry, Helen. For everything." That was the last time I saw him. A few months later, he passed away in his sleep. In his will, he left me the chest I'd found in the attic, along with a letter. It said, "I've made mistakes, but finding you again was the one thing I did right. The money you found under Lucky's is yours, use it to build something beautiful." And that's exactly what I did. I donated most of it to a local shelter in his name, keeping only a small portion to remodel the home Joe built for me. Every time I sit on my porch now, I think about my father, flawed, complicated, and human, and I realize that even in the darkest corners of our past, there's a light worth finding. Life went on after my father's passing, but the story didn't stop there. You see, that little metal box from Lucky's bar wasn't quite done revealing its secrets. About 6 months after I donated the money, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was one of those spam calls about extended car warranties. But something made me pick up. On the other end of the line was a man with a gravelly voice. "Is this Helen?" he asked, sounding hesitant. "Yes." "Who's asking?" I replied, cautious. "My name's Jack," he said. I knew your father. William. We worked together a long time ago. At first, I thought it was just another loose end from my father's gambling days. But as Jack started talking, my blood ran cold. He wasn't just some drinking buddy or poker table acquaintance. Jack claimed he was with my father the night Lucky was killed. And he had a very different version of the story. "I've carried this for over 50 years, Jack said. But now that your father's gone, I think you deserve to know the truth." According to Jack, Lucky wasn't just a bar owner. He was running a smuggling operation out of his bar, money laundering, stolen goods, the whole 9 yards. My father had gotten caught up in it, working as a courier to pay off his gambling debts. But one night, Lucky accused him of skimming from the deliveries. That's when things turned violent. "Your dad didn't kill Lucky," Jack said firmly. "He tried to stop it. But there was someone else there that night. A guy named Vince, Lucky's so-called partner. He's the one who pulled the trigger." My head spun. If what Jack said was true, then my father hadn't been running from his guilt. He'd been running from Vince. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was holding something back, so I asked if he knew what happened to Vince. He hesitated before answering. Last I heard, he was still alive, Jack said. Living under a fake name somewhere in the Midwest. But you didn't hear that from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea that the real killer might still be out there haunted me. And worse, I couldn't help but wonder, had Vince sent the mysterious letter that led me to Lucky's bar? Was he watching me? Testing me? The next morning, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Tony, a sharp, no-nonsense guy with a reputation for digging up dirt no one else could find. I gave him everything I had, the photographs, the newspaper articles, even Jack's phone number. It took Tony 3 weeks to track down Vince. He was living in a small town in Indiana under the name Victor Harlow. And here's the kicker, he was still working in bars, now as a quiet manager of a roadside dive. Tony warned me not to go, said it wasn't safe. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know the truth. So, against his advice, I booked a flight to Indiana. When I walked into Vince's bar, my heart was pounding. It was a dimly lit, smoke-filled place, the kind where everyone stops talking when a stranger walks in. Vince was behind the counter, cleaning glasses. He was older now, gray-haired, with a hunched back, but there was no mistaking him. He had the same cold eyes as in the photographs from Lucky's. I didn't beat around the bush. I walked right up to him and said, "You knew William, didn't you?" He froze, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "His daughter," I said, my voice steady. "And I know what you did." For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But instead, he leaned in close and whispered, "Careful, lady. You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, I think I do," I shot back. "You've been hiding for decades, and I'm the one who found you. You're not as untouchable as you think." To my surprise, he didn't get angry. He just laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Your old man was a fool," he said. "Always thought he could play hero. But heroes don't last long in my line of work." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the back room. I thought about following him, but my gut told me it wasn't worth the risk. I'd gotten what I came for, confirmation. When I got back home, I called Jack to tell him what had happened. He wasn't surprised. "Vince always thought he was untouchable," Jack said. "But you showing up? That's gotta rattle him. He's probably looking over his shoulder right now." I asked Jack one final question. Why didn't my father ever tell me any of this? Why didn't he fight to clear his name? Jack sighed. Because he didn't think it mattered. To him, being your dad was more important than being a hero. He didn't want you growing up in the shadow of his mistakes. In the end, I didn't pursue Vince any further. There was no point. He was an old man now, living with the weight of his sins. And my father? He may not have been perfect, but he'd done the best he could with the cards he was dealt. Now, when I sit on my porch, I think about the journey this chest took me on, from the attic in Oregon to Lucky's bar, to the quiet streets of Indiana. It was messy and complicated, just like my father. But it gave me something I never expected, closure, and a deeper understanding of the man who shaped my life in ways I'm still discovering. And maybe, just maybe, that's all any of us can ask for in the end. I thought my story was over. I thought I could finally close the chapter on my father, Lucky's bar, and Vince. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. A year after my trip to Indiana, I received another letter. This one wasn't cryptic, it was official, sealed with the emblem of a law office. The letter informed me that Vince had passed away. And here's the kicker, he had left something for me in his will. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I wasn't sure what to expect. The attorney, a serious-looking man in a crisp suit, handed me a small box. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. The note read, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Check the safe in the cellar of Lucky's. You deserve to know the whole truth." I felt a chill run down my spine. What more could there possibly be to uncover? The next day, I was back on a plane to Reno, clutching that key like it was the last thread of a mystery I hadn't even realized was unfinished. The bar was abandoned now, its doors padlocked and windows boarded up. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I found a way in through a broken side window, flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The cellar was just as I imagined, dark, damp, and filled with the musty smell of old wood and spilled beer. At the back of the room, hidden behind stacks of crates, I found it, a rusted safe bolted to the floor. My hands trembled as I inserted the key. The lock clicked open, and the heavy door creaked as I pulled it apart. Inside was a small bundle of documents, brittle with age. As I unfolded them, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't just papers, they were ledgers, contracts, and photographs. Proof of everything: Lucky's smuggling operation, Vince's involvement, and even payments made to law enforcement to keep it all quiet. But the most shocking part? There were pages implicating people I never would have suspected: judges, politicians, even prominent business owners. It was a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Lucky's bar. At the very bottom of the stack was a letter from my father. "Helen, if you're reading this, it means you've come farther than I ever dared. I've spent my life running from the truth, but you've faced it head-on. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you everything myself. This safe holds the truth about the night Lucky died and the people who profited from it. I don't know what you'll do with it, but I trust you'll make the right choice. Love always. Dad." I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of the documents pressing down on me. What was I supposed to do? Expose it all? Burn it and let the past stay buried? In the end, I made my decision. I took the ledgers and the photographs to the local newspaper, the same one that had published the article about Lucky's death all those years ago. The reporter who met with me was young, ambitious, and determined to uncover the truth. Together, we pored over the documents, piecing together the story my father had hidden for so long. The exposé made national headlines. It didn't just reveal the corruption tied to Lucky's bar, it uncovered decades of dirty dealings that had shaped the town's history. People were arrested, reputations were ruined, and long-hidden secrets finally came to light. But here's the thing, even after all of that, the story didn't feel like it was just about justice. For me, it was about redemption, my father's, Vince's, and maybe even my own. The chest that started it all now sits in my living room, its lock repaired but never fastened. It reminds me that sometimes the past isn't something we can leave behind. Sometimes we have to face it, wrestle with it, and come out the other side stronger. On clear nights, I sit on my porch with a cup of tea, looking up at the stars. I think about my father, his mistakes, his regrets, and his quiet courage in leaving me the pieces I needed to uncover the truth. And I like to think that somewhere, he's watching, finally at peace. Because in the end, the truth didn't just set him free, it set me free, too. And that, my friends, is where my story ends. Or maybe, just maybe, it's where it truly begins.